Welcome to The City That Votes, a television series from the Chicago Board of Elections, taking you behind the polling place curtain for a look at how our election system works in the Windy City. I'm Max Bever, Director of Public Information, and your host for the program. So today, you may see that I am flying solo. I hope that you'll stick with me as I discuss the most recent March 17th primary election and break down some statistics and takeaways. I'm also going to talk about some key dates and info for the upcoming November 3rd general election, some facts and deadlines for 2027 municipal candidates, yes, that election's coming too, and answer some viewer questions from our ballot box. So here's hoping that my voice doesn't go out. But let's take a look first at the wrap-up for our March 17th primary election. From a communications director's perspective, this is the type of election that we like to see. Ultimately, there were higher than usual turnout than we see for primary elections. But we got a couple of graphics for you that I want to take a look at these numbers. So for the March 17th primary election, we saw 424,564 ballots cast for an over 27% citywide turnout, 27.3 for our over 1.5 million active registered voters for the city. Now, 27.3%, that doesn't sound like something maybe that election officials like us would like to celebrate, but I'm going to say that that's higher than the state average, which saw just over 22% turnout statewide. Compared to some of the previous primary elections in Chicago too, our June 28th, 2022 primary election saw just over 22%. So ultimately, what we did see was a higher than regular turnout for this election, which was good to see in the city of Chicago. Let's take a look at some of that additional info of how many ballots were cast on election day. So that was 210,312 ballots that were cast on election day itself. That is a habit that Chicagoans are not going to break anytime soon. They do love showing up to vote at their precinct polling places on election day. But we also saw over 21,321 ballots cast at vote centers. So over 10% of our election day voters chose one of our early voting sites that was open 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. On election day, or use that location to drop off their vote by mail ballot too. I'm going to show those statistics in a moment. This is an interesting statistic because over 10% of our election day voters are now using any of our early voting sites which serve as our Vote Anywhere vote centers. A really important safety net for our voters if they can't make it to their precinct polling place. Also a convenience for our voters. Why we keep talking about this is that it is flexible for voters. You can go to any of those vote centers. We've got 51 that are open on election day, and more voters are taking advantage of this. Like previous elections, we just saw under 50% of our voters show up on election day, 49.54. This is a trend that we're seeing happen, especially since the pandemic. Election day used to be where we saw 70%, 80%, 90%, even if you're heading back to the 1980s, of voters show up. Now with early voting and vote by mail options, we're seeing so much more of our voters choose whatever way is most convenient for them, but we still have about half of our voters showing up for that election day in the city of Chicago. So let's talk a little bit about early voting then too. About a quarter of our city continues to love to early vote. We saw over 102,641 early voting ballots cast for this March 17th primary election, for just over 24% of the total ballots cast. This continues to be a very convenient way for voters. When you've got early voting open up at least 4 weeks before election day, it gives voters plenty of time to research their choices. We did see what we usually see in a primary election, which is More and more as the election day gets closer, more people are early voting. They're waiting a little bit close to election day, a little bit to the last second. But that's also very common for primary elections, where people are taking some time to research their options. Maybe you have your choices picked for your ballot 4 weeks before election day. Maybe you're waiting to see what those candidates say. That's still a lot of time before election day. But no matter what, those early voting sites were open, and Chicagoans took advantage of early voting for this primary election. And then finally, let's talk a little bit about the vote-by-mail ballots cast in this last election. We saw 111,611 vote-by-mail ballots cast. So that's over a quarter of the total ballots cast, 26.29%. And then a few more interesting points that I want to point out here. So we ultimately had over 172,000 vote-by-mail ballots that were mailed. Those applications were processed. So we did see a 64.73% successful return rate. That's lower than we'd like to see. A lot of that was coming from our permanent roster. Those are the people who are signed up to receive every ballot. Those voters sometimes change their mind of whether or not they want to vote in a primary election. Well, what I'm very happy to see is these next two data points, where we saw over 55,000 of our vote-by-mail ballots that were received via secure drop box for this last election. That is nearly half of all vote-by-mail ballots, and that's 49.58%. Now, that's a pretty interesting statistic because nearly half of vote-by-mail ballots actually weren't returned back through the mail in this last March 17th primary election. That is actually good news when it comes to the city of Chicago. So much attention was paid, good attention towards the possibility of a postmark delay, that if you put your ballot back in the mail less than 7 days before Election Day, there was no guarantee from the U.S. Post Office that they would be getting that all-important Election Day postmark on there. Seems like a lot of voters were listening. A lot of voters heeded those warnings. And as we were getting closer to Election Day, we saw those rates at secure drop boxes continue to rise and continue to rise to where we saw over 55,000 ballots and nearly half of our total vote-by-mail ballots returned via those secure drop boxes at our early voting sites and our vote centers on Election Day. And one last bit of data that I'd like to share here is that we only saw 1,046 ballots rejected that ultimately were not cured by voters, including late or insufficient postmark. So that is under 1% of our vote-by-mail ballots that were cast. So how much that we were worried, how a lot of election officials were worried, and other election officials across the country, of how many ballots were going to get rejected because of that postmark issue. Less than 1%, and that includes other reasons, signature mismatches, or that the voter didn't get to cure their ballot in time of those vote-by-mail ballots being returned. So ultimately, that is pretty good numbers for what we see for our vote-by-mail, and that we're seeing a lot more of voters are taking advantage of those secure drop boxes. Keeps talking about that as an option for voters, but every time we have another election, and especially as there's lines at early voting that last weekend leading up to Election Day, I think that we convert a few more voters into vote by mail. You might be waiting in line, it might be a half hour, you see that vote by mail voter come up, drop off their ballot into that secure drop box, and then just walk out. The feedback that we get from our vote-by-mail voters is ultimately they really like that time of having their ballot. That ballot gets mailed out 40 days before Election Day. They have additional time to sit at their kitchen counter, to do their research, to look at the many different voter resources that are out there, including judge recommendations from Injustice Watch. And then ultimately, they're going to take that to their local library. They're going to take that to their local college, whatever's the closest or the most convenient option for them, and return that back by hand because they know that that's going to get back into the board's hands. So ultimately, what we saw was a very similar election to what we'd seen to previous primaries and some of our other previous elections, where nearly half of Chicago's voters showed up for Election Day, about a quarter early voted, and then ultimately about a quarter voted by mail as well. So nothing that was out of the ordinary, the type of election that we like to see. It was safe. Election Day was, dare I say, maybe a little bit boring, but that's also good ultimately for election officials. We saw the usual type of issues tend to crop up, but thankfully only a handful of election sites that weren't open by 6 a.m. Election judges got them open pretty quickly after that, so we had no court-mandated delays or openings for or closing times for Election Day. So everything went really quite smooth for an election that we had a lot of planning for, a lot of concerns for security, a lot of concerns of whether or not federal agents would be involved on Election Day. Thankfully, what we saw on March 17th was smooth, it was safe, it had a higher than usual type of turnout, and I think what a lot of election officials like to see is a lot of those races were called by the AP the night of, and that people and those campaigns were able to move on. Now we're looking forward to the November 3rd, 2026 general election. So as you know, primary elections for the majority of these offices are nearly nominating the candidate that will appear on that November ballot. So ultimately, voters are going to be choosing a lot of these candidates again, but comparatively to the primary, where you have to choose a specific party ballot, ultimately you'll be voting for all of the candidates in November. One last bit of wrap-up of data. I don't have a graphic for this, but the party ballots that were selected for this March 17th primary election, maybe not a surprise for the city of Chicago, but the Democratic turnout, we saw over 399,000 ballots cast for voters choosing a Democratic Party ballot, which was nearly 94% of all ballots cast. For Republican turnout, we saw over 24,000 ballots cast for 5.7% of the ballots cast. And we had the Libertarian turnout for 1,315 ballots cast, which was 0.31% of total ballots cast. Comparatively to other years, we did not have a Green Party ballot, and interestingly, we did not have a nonpartisan ballot, where usually a lot of voters do enjoy that option. A nonpartisan ballot in the city of Chicago for our primary election includes all the referenda questions, or local option questions, that might have appeared in that precinct or citywide. We just didn't have any citywide referendum questions, binding or otherwise, or any local precinct questions. So that nonpartisan option did not exist. But it might for the future. So if you are a permanent roster voter, you can keep your preference when it comes to receiving that nonpartisan ballot for primary elections. But ultimately, that was the turnout for the parties. Now, let's talk a little bit more about nonpartisan elections, because we do have some nonpartisan candidates that will be appearing on the November 3rd, 2026 general election ballot. Now, I think I'm going to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about our upcoming elections. Now, you don't have too much of a break. We're going to have a summer, but from November, then to February, then to April, Chicago is going to have 3 elections in a row, including our general election, and then what is known as our municipal election and our municipal runoff election. But let's talk about some of the key dates leading up to the November 3rd election and that ballot, and who you might be seeing in the streets, at your grocery store, as you're heading to the CTA, as you're parking your car. You're going to be seeing candidates out there with their clipboards again, asking for your signature. So what are they asking for? What are some of these candidates running for? Well, they're either independent candidates for the November 3rd ballot, or in the city of Chicago, which you're likely about to see a lot of candidates start asking for your signature, is for the Chicago Elected School Board. So those candidates are currently collecting their signatures, and they're about to file them in May. So you might have met some of these candidates, on your way to the office, already talked about them, keeping an eye on these candidates. But ultimately, they are going to be filing for the November ballot on May 18th, downtown in the city of Chicago, to appear on that November ballot. And then ultimately, June 2nd, that's going to be the deadline for objections to those candidates. That's right, we're going to go through all the electoral board process again. We've covered this with some of our guests in the past, including our general counsel, Adam Lasker, taking us through the Chicago electoral board process. If you do have questions, I recommend go to chicagooelections.gov. We've got a whole page dedicated to petition filing, as well as the Chicago electoral board process. As well, if you're a candidate, to visit our candidates resources page. Now, the Chicago Board of Elections, we have to be very careful when it comes to talking with candidates, help guiding them through the process, just to make sure that we are not giving them any undue attention or legal advice. So we want to send all candidates ultimately to our website at chicagooelections.gov. If you've got any questions, those resources are there for you. So that is the deadlines for the upcoming Chicago Elected School Board. Who else is out there with a clipboard that wants to talk to you and maybe get your signature? Well, a couple of other things too. Ultimately, there are two other questions that can appear on your November 3rd ballot. That is if you are voting on a local referendum question, or you're voting on what's known as a local option question, whether or not a precinct should be voted dry of alcohol or be voted wet with alcohol. So ultimately, whether or not alcohol is allowed in your precinct or area. So you're going to have some people that are going to be collecting signatures for those questions too. What is a referendum question? Well, you collect enough signatures to appear in a precinct. Many people collect enough signatures to appear in an entire ward. A little bit difficult to collect enough signatures to appear citywide, but it could happen. But ultimately, you're going to see some people within your communities that are going to be asking to put either a non-binding or a binding question on that ballot. Sometimes it's just asking questions of whether or not a development should be built, of whether or not there should be a community benefits agreement as part of a larger project. Sometimes it's more basic questions. We've got a demonstration ballot where we ask the important question of whether or not ketchup should go on a hot dog. So as a voter, you have that right. You can put a local question on your ballot, as well as organize whether or not alcohol should be allowed or alcohol should be banned within your precinct. Some deadlines on that. July 2nd is that deadline for that local option, for that wet-dry precinct question to be asked. And August 3rd is the last day for filing petitions when it comes to adding that referendum question on the ballot for November. Now, who else might be asking for your signature soon? Well, candidates are getting ready for the 2027 elections as well. That is our municipal and our aldermanic elections, and that gets a lot of attention in our city. And we'd like to see, a lot more turnout for this upcoming February 23rd, 2027 election. Why do we have to plan so far in advance? That's the way that elections work, but that's also the election code, which has bumped up the petition collecting for the municipal election earlier than it has been in previous years. So thankfully, that gives some time for our candidates to collect their signatures in the summer. So starting July 28th, that is the petition circulation period for mayoral candidates, for aldermanic candidates, for police district council, as well as for other city offices like treasurer and city clerk. So all of those candidates are going to soon be asking for your signature to appear on the ballot, and they are a nonpartisan office. So similar to the elected Chicago School Board, you will be able to sign for them. It is not connected to a party, but I do want to bring up an important point, and this is true for our elected school board independent candidates, any independent congressional or state representative candidates, as well as these aldermanic, mayoral, and city office and police district candidates. You can only sign one of their petitions as a nonpartisan question, as a nonpartisan candidate. Ultimately, there's a lot of people that are looking for your signature, that are wanting to talk to you, but you can really only sign for one candidate. So if you sign for multiple and that candidate is objected to, that signature will probably get scratched off or objected to as part of that process. So this is an opportunity to already start looking into the candidates that are asking for your signatures, whether or not they have a website, whether or not they have a social media presence, whether or not they're already putting their views out for larger discussion as part of their campaign. Otherwise, talk with the person who's collecting those signatures. Usually those are the candidates themselves, especially the elected school board district. So if you've got questions about their views, about what they'd bring to the office, and about anything else about why they are running in the first place, engage in that conversation in real time. Because I do want to warn you that ultimately, for those nonpartisan candidates, you can only sign one of those petitions. So let's go through a little bit more of the dates as we're heading into November. So those are all the petition filing dates, but we're going to do this election all over again. August 5th already is when vote by mail applications open. So if you like voting by mail, you can make an application to vote by mail for November anytime after August 5th. If you are a permanent roster voter, don't worry about anything. You're already signed up to receive your November 3rd, 2026 ballots. However, we do recommend that if you have moved, make sure that you're updating your registration, which will automatically update your permanent roster. or if you need to send your permanent roster vote-by-mail ballot to a different location within the country, within the state, to a different location in the city, you can do so, use our online application. Just make sure that you're doing that at least 2 to 3 weeks before Election Day to give yourself plenty of time to receive that ballot. Ultimately, we've got those vote-by-mail ballots beginning to be mailed on September 24th. And that's ultimately the deadline, too, that if you want to be a poll watcher, you're going to file for your credentials with the Chicago Board of Elections by September 24th. What is a poll watcher? That is somebody who watches the polls. And they're a member of a civic organization or a candidate or a campaign. Ultimately, you're going to be working with a group to serve as a poll watcher. So if you've served as one in the past or you'd like to serve one, reach out to a civic organization, to a party, to a candidate, to a campaign, to ask if you can serve in that capacity. They're going to help you file to ultimately be a poll watcher for that upcoming election. Registration deadlines. Ultimately, October 6th is the deadline for paper registration. So if you're old-fashioned or if you're a voter registrar like myself, make sure that you're getting all those paper registrations back in by October 6th deadline. What happens on October 7th, the very next day? Well, that's when same-day registration begins. So thankfully in the state of Illinois, it's still easier to vote than ever. It's still easier to get registered to vote than ever. There's always a safety net that's supporting you when it comes to registration, and that's called same-day registration. So if you want to go early vote or vote on Election Day, that day after, you can use what's called same-day registration, bringing 2 forms of ID, one with your current address on them, to any of those locations to update your address, update your name, or even get registered in the first place. So ultimately, that is going to be your deadline, and that takes you all the way through Election Day. Last day to register to vote online is October 18th. So you're going to go to ova.elections.il.gov. You can go to that website anytime through that last day to make sure that your registration is up to date and that you get registered or cancel your registration ahead of Election Day. Then ultimately, October 29th is going to be the last day to apply to vote by mail. We recommend that you do that much ahead of schedule, but that's going to be taking us into November 3rd, 2026 general election. Future episode, we're going to talk a bit more about what that entails, what's on the ballot, and all the other good details leading us into Election Day. But since I'm already running a little bit low on time, I figured I've got some extra time to answer some ballot box questions. In fact, I've got a ballot box for the first time. I think visuals are kind of fun. But let's answer a few that are coming out of here that we got from folks. And this one was from Troy B. But he is asking, do employers have to give employees time off from work to vote? Very important question. Yes, employees are always entitled to at least 2 hours off work if that employee gives the employer notice prior to Election Day, and that employer may specify the hours during which the employee may be absent. But that employer must permit a 2-hour period for that voter to vote, and ultimately that voter can choose whatever his option is most convenient for them. If they can't make it home to their precinct polling place, they can have that 2 hours off and vote at one of our vote centers on Election Day or on the early voting period leading up to Election Day. All right, we've got another one. This one is Carol G. Well, it's a common question from a primary election, but do I have to declare a political party in order to vote in a primary election, and can I change my preferred party? So common question we were getting during this primary, I want to vote multiple. I want a Democratic ballot, a Republican ballot, and a Libertarian ballot. Unfortunately, that is not how it works in the state of Illinois. You can ask and request any party ballot that you want, but you can only vote one party, and you can choose whatever party that is every single election, including if you're on the permanent roster. You make sure that you just update that whenever you want to what the available ballots are. But ultimately, this is part of the reason why we see some of those voters want to wait for that general election where they can vote on all the party candidates. But we do urge you, why not vote in every election? And you can make that selection for a party, every single election. Ultimately, I thought I had a little bit more time for these, but we'll return back and answer some more voter questions in the future for another episode. But I appreciate you letting me fly solo for this episode and spitting a lot of numbers at you. But I want everyone to feel prepared like they knew everything from this previous election and heading into the next one. So why don't we wrap up? So thank you for joining us for the City That Votes from the Chicago Board of Elections. You can learn more about the upcoming November 3rd general election and initial info for the February 23rd, 2027 municipal election by going to chicagoelections.gov. And please follow us on social media. We are at Chicago Election on Facebook, Instagram, X, Blue Sky, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And you can contact me at communications@chicagoelections.gov to ask a ballot box question or let me know what you might want to know more about behind the scenes at the Chicago Board of Elections. Until next time, I'm Max Bever, Director of Public Information, and thank you for tuning in.